Welcome and thank you for joining us for today's session, Introduction to Azure Arc-enabled Data Services. My name is Dave Kurt. I'm a senior program or product manager for the Edge infrastructure, and I'm joined here today by Lior. Many of you probably have seen him before. Lior, please introduce yourself.
Hey, Dave. My name is Lior Kamrat, a principal product manager as part of the Azure Arc platform team. Great to be here.
Yes, thank you again for taking the time today to join us for this session as we're walking through these learning modules. I hope many of you are familiar with Azure Arc. If not, we're going to cover some of the basics, but there will also be links in the end if you want to learn more. We have a few learning objectives for today's session, which is hopefully after this session, you're being able to describe why hybrid computing is an important technology strategy for many users and businesses. You hear that probably often, the quote from Satya, where he talked about that we don't see hybrid as a state in between, but for many companies, it will be the end state. It's something that is here to stay. You should also be able to describe what Azure Arc-enabled data services is and why it can be an important part of your hybrid compute and data strategy. And you also be able to describe the managed capabilities and benefits of using Azure Arc-enabled SQL managed instance, and describe managed capabilities and benefits of using Azure Arc-enabled PostgreSQL. That's for the learning objectives.
Good stuff. Good stuff.
Good stuff. A lot to cover. But again, like if you're new to that scene, don't worry. We will cover some of the basics, and not in depth, but we will definitely provide you with some of the links in the end for anything you want to learn more. And feel free also to follow us along. I'm quickly going to jump back here to this slide. You see the short URL on this side, the AKMS/learn live with the nice number. And I think you will also see that at the bottom. So I leave that very quickly here before we jump to the Learn Live modules. Also, if you have questions, feel free, whatever platform you're watching on. We have a nice moderator who will pop those questions or relay those questions to us, and we will try our best to answer them as they're coming in.
Yeah, I already see a bunch of folks. So thanks for joining, everyone. We'll try to answer all the questions in the chat. So let's go. Let's have some fun.
Okay, so let's switch to my screen. I'll show you the website where you find this learning path. If you are not familiar, the Learn or Microsoft Learn is hosted on the Docs website. You should have seen the AKMS links, which is kind of like has for all kinds of Microsoft technologies. Here we're focusing obviously on Azure, and then we have different learning paths. This one is the Introduction to Azure Arc-enabled Data Services, which consists out of 6 learning units that we're basically covering here today. I've already walked you through the learning objectives on what that is, and when we go here, you see here are some prerequisites, basic knowledge of Azure. Again, you don't need in-depth, but we're basically not covering what the public cloud is or that Azure is part of our public cloud offering. So we're thinking that you already have that. So we're not going in depth to it.
We sure hope so.
We sure hope so, yes. And then we're basically having these modules ahead of us. We're starting with a bit of a broad introduction into hybrid, that why we're doing this, the investments for doing this area, then about more general, that's where we cover few parts of Arc in general, not just the enabled data services. And then Lior will be so kind and walk us right through in how we can actually enable those Arc-enabled data services, what you can do with SQL managed instance, as well as PostgreSQL. And then we're going to close this out.
I am a kind person.
You're very kind. That's for sure. So I'll jump right into the introduction, and I'll go a little bit off script, but feel free to read along. But as you know, many businesses are looking today to invest in cloud services, and the reason obviously is cloud services have a lot of benefits, right? Like in the traditional sense, specifically PaaS services, which many organizations look forward to use data PaaS services like SQL DBMI in the cloud because they don't have to worry about the infrastructure below. and just basically can take advantage of that innovation, which can reduce or can lead to a lower total cost of ownership and provide more redundancy, reliability, and efficiency, as you can benefit of the big investments cloud provider like ourselves do in providing that underlying infrastructure. Now, not all organizations are yet in a position to completely deploy databases or the applications in the public clouds for variety of reasons, right? Could be compliance. Maybe you're in a regulated industries, or it's a certain workload that has different requirement, internal regulations. It's not just external regulatory requirements. You may want to be able to have more control, or you may even have existing infrastructure investment that you made recently that you wanted to take advantage, and maybe you plan in a few years to migrate, whatever it might be. There is a lot of reasons, and I think, Lior, you can also talk a little bit to it, right? You talk a lot to customers, you had a lot of touch points. We're working a lot with our people in the field of like some of the reasons. Maybe you have some examples you like to mention.
Yeah, I think that what we're hearing from customers with regards to data services, there are multiple use cases, but the ones that are really keep coming back is what you mentioned, is the data sovereignty, right? That's the number one use case that we're seeing a lot of the time in environments that, like you mentioned, highly regulated, got to meet certain compliance requirements and all that jazz. So there's that, but also you can also find those customers that are actually looking for bringing or incorporating their kind of CI and CD practices into or leveraging those capabilities that we're offering with Azure Arc-enabled data services and bring those into their own practices. And how does that look like? Because they're looking to modernize their application sets or looking to modernize their deployment models. But a lot of the time they can't do that because they have certain constraints on doing things locally. So again, these are some of those use cases that we're seeing. That's for sure. So yeah, I mean, I'm looking forward for this one today, because we're going to touch about a lot of this stuff and try to connect the dots for everyone. Just going to make sure that everyone understands the technology here in a nutshell and take it from there.
And so you might wonder, so we talked very briefly about the PaaS services, the popularity of PaaS services in the cloud that helps with that scalability, etc. And so in those cases where customer they can't move a specific workload, or they are running something that needs to run on premises for this variety of reasons we covered, these companies still would like to take advantage of that innovation in the cloud.
Right.
And so when Microsoft decided, hey, we need to bring our PaaS services even to wherever the customer needs to run. That could be in another cloud platform, could be in the on-premises. And you might wonder, okay, why would anybody want to do that? I had myself the pleasure to once do a demo at the Gartner conference where we deployed SQL DBMI, the managed instance, on AWS. And the reason there is, you mentioned, of companies that are big SQL powerhouses. They use a lot of SQL. They may have a merger acquisition, or there is another team in that company that uses a different cloud, because if they have skills or expertise in that AWS. But if you run the compliance team or whatnot, you're like, okay, great, awesome. So you guys run servers on that server, SQL that manage and patch everything. You can continue using SQL Server, but I'm going to use Arc-enabled SQL service. So we're out of that end-of-life support, kind of you get an always screen on, scalable. I get some of the advanced security features by running it there. But you still I'm not forcing you to migrate your application from this cloud provider to this, whatnot. So I'm bringing you the benefits of similar that what I have in Azure to that other cloud or to your on-premises. And that's really what this is about, is enabling you taking advantage of some of that PaaS, let's say, goodness that PaaS services bring also on-premises, but obviously in on-premises, you would also run the underlying Kubernetes platform, as you can see. But you have also here the power of options. It's your choice. So it's not like one flavor of Kubernetes that is only supported. Again, Microsoft here wants to take that step into your reality, and that reality is not all of you going to use the same Kubernetes platforms or whatnot to go basically into those areas.
And before we kind of jumping into the weeds here, I think that maybe to kind of wrap this thought, because you mentioned and there's a very interesting word that you use, like forcing. So I just want to level set here for a second. And every time I'm doing a session or presentation around this is one of the first things that I'm saying. Azure Arc was always designed with a non-disruptive state of mind. That means that the way that Azure Arc was designed is to make sure, and we're going to touch that later in the next modules, but really what we try to do with Azure Arc is we try to bring the same practices and the same patterns that you're using today in your own environments, whether via whatever tools that you're using or whatever application deployment models that you currently have. And what we're trying to do with Azure Arc, we're trying to be non-disruptive in the sense that you should still be able to use the same tools, the same tool chain, the same processes and patterns, only with services that are now deployed in an infrastructure that you control. Okay, and that's what we're going to dive deeper today in this session.
Absolutely. And so now that we cover kind of like the introduction, talking about why businesses are in that hybrid state or multi-cloud reality and why
let's get down to business
services, let's jump to the next module, which is learning about hybrid computing. Now, here you see the definition of hybrid compute connects on-premise systems to one or more public cloud systems. This is where multi-cloud come in. I know there's all these words, edge, hybrid, cloud, on-premises, but it's basically a application or something that runs in different places but fulfills the same purpose or comes together to make something reality and providing some consistency. And so the goal of hybrid is to provide you that single application experience across with simple deployment, governance, and management. And hybrid gives you the ability to use your current on-premises investments that we covered briefly in the introduction before. And it also allows you kind of like to bring the compute systems to the best performance wherever you need to do those calculations or you want to run this intelligence over the data that you're collecting. And so with hybrid computing, you get a uniform security, a unified billing and management data collection and reporting system, which goes to what I talked, the goodness of PaaS services, but on the environment of your choosing.
Yeah. And, Steve, one thing that I always like to bring up when we're talking or we're having the conversation about the fundamentals of hybrid and what does that mean? I always like to take people down to memory lane, probably 10 years ago, when people still thought that hybrid means, including myself, by the way, that hybrid really means network connectivity. Like people used to think that, okay, so I have either express route or site-to-site VPN, and that means that I'm hybrid now. But, fast forwarding a few years, and now we're talking about the Azure Arc, we all know that that's not really the case. Hybrid is really about, I want to say, the control plane, the software layer of how a pattern will look like or how an infrastructure pattern will look like, right? Is it going to be something that is stretched across your on-premises and cloud deployments? Is it something that you're going to leverage in a multi-cloud environment? But it's not really about the network connectivity. Network connectivity is a given. These days it's just like, okay, yeah, sure, you're going to have network connectivity in some shape or form. Hybrid is really about how do you take capabilities that are in one cloud and bring those to the masses in infrastructure and other environment that the same cloud, obviously talking about Azure here, doesn't have any control on. So that's really what this is all about here.
This is actually a very good gateway for right into the deployment, because you mentioned that a little bit of the DevOps cycle. So maybe I let you also quickly just cover that part that talks about how it's a declarative stateful method of deployment. Again, it's not just the connectivity.
Right.
But
right. And
go ahead.
Yeah, and Steve, we again, we'll talk about the notion of what is required in order for you to actually go and deploy Azure Arc-enabled data service. We'll talk about Kubernetes as the foundation. We'll talk about all this stuff in a moment here. But in a nutshell, when it comes to a DevOps conversation, without throwing a lot of buzzwords into the mix, right? But when it comes to continuous integration, the deployment methodologies and practices, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is we're trying to see how we can fit our own PaaS services into your existing deployment models, right? We'll talk today about Azure Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance and PostgreSQL. We'll talk about all of that. But really what you want to think about is, or what we're trying to deliver here and teach the audience is, how do you want to think about this for your own practices, okay? How do I take an Azure Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance and include that as part of my deployment models? How do I tell my applications to, okay, this is the database that you're going to talk to right now. And yes, I know that it sits on premises and I know that it's not in the cloud, right? So these type of stuff are really interesting and looking forward to dive deeper.
So this is what we're covering right now. Is like some of the things that you should consider for your hybrid computing. One is like how you will deploy, which Lior just talked us through a little bit. The other thing, obviously, is governance is huge, as you all know. I can tell you I had so many conversations and discussions on this topic, all the way to where some of the CISOs love the capabilities that with cloud services, like even when you think SaaS, like Microsoft 365, etc., they can go to a portal and pull the reports, and they wished they could do that across all their environments. And to what Lior talked about with that, upper layer of management of where Arc in general comes in, and Arc-enabled services, really to kind of like, you have your on-premises systems, you maybe have branch offices, you may use hoster in some of the countries that you're operating in, you may use one cloud, two clouds, whatever it is. But at the end, you need to drive governance across all of this. And often those are independent silos, and where Arc really can help. And what is top of mind for Microsoft as we're making this enablement is really like, how can you drive governance across all your systems, everywhere you have things, to make sure that you can fulfill your regulatory requirements, whatever that might be, etc. So think of that in your hybrid. How can it help me with governance if you talk about what your hybrid compute needs are? And then obviously the management that brings it all together. Also, like, your IT team, do they have to go to 20 different tools to distribute something or manage the servers, or can they go to a centralized place where they have access and can do something at scale, roll out changes to the environment at scales, etc. And so that's a little bit the over to Microsoft Azure Arc and hybrid computing systems. So here you see there's a bunch of links that you can go to dip deeper from what are Azure hybrid cloud solutions. The hybrid benefit is more of a licensing, where you have rights for SQL and Windows servers to also run it for free in the cloud. If you have it on premises, you see we have solutions with VMware. Then obviously a product I'm very familiar with, Azure Stack, Microsoft Sentinel, who can help you with the SIEM needs across any cloud, any environment, any device that you need. And then the network connectivity that Lior mentioned, obviously at the heart of everything that is distributed across multiple locations, with VPN gateway, ExpressRoute, and then, of course, Arc. And when we look at Azure Arc, it's kind of like in a few buckets, or we can put it in a few categories. At the very basics, we have Azure Arc-enabled servers, which runs for Windows and Linux. This is to what I mentioned briefly with like your environment. If that is branch offices, hoster, any cloud, you can basically connect those to the control plane in Azure, and then use Azure tooling to kind of like drive the consistent governance management. If I'm IT admin at your company, as an example, it would allow me through the Azure portal to do a lot of my daily tasks, all through that portal experience, which is awesome. And then the same goes for Kubernetes. And also with Kubernetes, it's a bunch of different Kubernetes platforms where you can then also run the Arc-enabled data services, which we cover in a minute. And that, again, is like the options is what Lior talked. This is, we don't want to disrupt you. It's not our way or the highway. It's really how can we enable you and help you achieve your governance goals, your management goals to be as efficient as possible and take advantage of what technology can offer to help you in the end to digitally transform your businesses.
Yeah.
And then SQL Server and Azure Arc-enabled services, that's for SQL Server itself. There is also an Arc-enabled server. So if you have a large SQL Server farm, this is not now the Arc-enabled SQL DBMI. This is if you have SQL Server, you can also, similar to what we do with the servers, which are VMs or bare metal servers, connect them up. And then as the grand finale for what we're covering in depth today, the Azure Arc-enabled data services, which now we talked a bunch of times about it. And with that, I think we're going to jump over to Lior, who will take us a little bit more down into the weeds of Arc-enabled data services.
Thanks, Steve. So I'll take the screen here, and before I'm jumping into the architecture and the weeds and all that, let's level set. Azure Arc is really a bi-directional thing. It's a set of technologies, but at the end of the day, it's a bi-directional thing in the sense that you have Azure Arc-enabled infrastructure, which basically means that, and we covered all of this in the other Learn models, the Microsoft Learn models, the live models that we had as part of this series. So I think we had like 12 of those, so covered in quite depth there. But just again, coming back to my point is that you have Azure Arc-enabled infrastructure. That's really about Azure Arc-enabled servers and Azure Arc-enabled SQL Server, like you mentioned, Steve, right? That's where you're bringing or projecting those on-premises or multi-cloud servers that are deployed outside of Azure, and you're bringing those as API entities into our own control plane, Azure Resource Manager. And you also have Azure Arc-enabled services, which is basically the other way around. We have Azure Arc-enabled data services. That's what we're going to talk about here in a second, where you can deploy data services on top of your infrastructure with Kubernetes. And then you have Azure Arc-enabled machine learning. Same goes for that. You can deploy the machine learning services on top of your infrastructure. Usually people are doing this in order for, running training models on premises and then using the cloud for the analytics layer where you have, the hyperscale capability, the elasticity, all those stuff. And you also have Azure Arc-enabled app services where you can deploy several app services offerings that we have, again, on top of your Kubernetes cluster. So just want to level set. So let's talk about Azure Arc-enabled data services. Azure Arc-enabled data services really splits into two as of today in terms of the offerings that we have. We have Azure Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance, and we have Azure Arc-enabled PostgreSQL. Azure Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance is kind of the same service that you're familiar with today with Azure. A lot of customers are going and deploying Azure SQL Managed Instance. What we're trying to do here is we are providing the same deal or the same offering on top of your own infrastructure, okay? And again, in a second, we'll talk about the architecture diagram that we have here as part of the Learn model and talk about all these layers inside that cake. We also have Azure Arc-enabled PostgreSQL. So again, if you're familiar with PostgreSQL on Azure, that's the same deal. We're trying to do the same here. This product is still in preview, and we are expecting to make some changes in the near future. Again, we'll talk about it. We have a specific module for PostgreSQL. We'll dive deeper into that. So let's just, I think that it's a good segue for us to just kind of talk about the architecture, how things look like. So I mentioned the fact that you have Azure Arc-enabled infrastructure, but you also have Azure Arc-enabled services. Now, between those two, there is Kubernetes. Kubernetes is kind of a funny thing if you're thinking about that in the sense of what Kubernetes was designed for. Kubernetes was designed for, as basically as a container orchestration mechanism or a platform to build other platform, which is exactly what we did, right? So Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes, right, is a technology that you can basically take on-premises or other cloud Kubernetes distributions and Arc-enable those. Now, at the moment that you're doing that, those Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes clusters are becoming legit targets for deploying those Azure Arc-enabled services that I was referring to. And what we're going to focus on is Azure Arc-enabled data services. So let's start to peel out this onion and start from the bottom, okay? So the first thing that you have is you have your infrastructure. On top of your own infrastructure, you control that. You have Kubernetes cluster. Now, the first thing that you need to do in order to make that Kubernetes cluster as a candidate for deploying Azure Arc-enabled data services, you need to Arc-enable that Kubernetes cluster. The moment that you are Arc-enabling that Kubernetes cluster, you have basically the option to start deploying extensions on top of that. That's the extensibility model. The extensibility model for Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes brings very important capabilities in the sense that you can deploy other services on top of that Kubernetes cluster, and basically the pipe to do that, or the technology that enables that, is extensions. Okay, so Azure Arc-enabled data services, we have our own extensions for that, and every other Azure Arc service has its own extension. Okay, so once you have that Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster, you're also gonna install the data controller. Okay, now the data controller is really what I like to call the brain of the octopus. Okay, data controller is the first piece for Azure Arc-enabled data services that you can deploy. That's basically the controller or the control plane for Azure Arc-enabled data services. Via this, this controller, you can go and deploy other services, SQL Managed Instance and PostgreSQL. So really, everything starts there. It's also important because the controller is what enable the logging, the metrics, and the billing usage as part of the deployment, and also responsible for reporting back to Azure. Okay, so that's a very important piece. So how do you go by and do that? If you want to deploy a controller, basically you can go into the portal, and I'll show you this in a second. You go to the portal and you just choose to deploy a controller. Now, when you want to deploy a controller, okay, you need an Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster. That's the first piece. We talked about it. And you can do that via either the portal or CLI, okay, or ARM templates, automation, whatnot. And this is a good opportunity to remind our audience here that, again, this notion of not trying to be disruptive, or trying our best not to be disruptive, I should say, because if you today are used to the Azure portal and you're used to our CLI or used to ARM templates, and really familiar with the notion of here's how I interact with Azure, we basically provided the same experience. Okay. On top of that, okay, because this is a Kubernetes environment, you can also do that via kubectl or kubectl. Depends which side of the camp you are. Okay, so that's really another very interesting point that I'm trying to bring here, because this is another common tool that people are using, obviously, with the Kubernetes environment. It's almost a fundamental, right? Kubectl. So you can go and deploy those services via those interfaces, which, again, this is really the notion of not trying to be disruptive or not being disruptive. Okay, so we covered that. Yeah, go ahead, Steve.
I just wanted to add, when you look at this architecture diagram and the not disruptive, you see all the different tools, right? Let's say after the deployment, your team can use Azure Data Studio. Again, trying not to disruptive, you're going to have different roles. You probably have the team that build up the infrastructure that maybe deployed to Kubernetes that goes there. You maybe have a second team depending on the size of the company, and then you have all your SQL engineers, etc., that might be already familiar with the data studio and want to continue using that. And so again, here kind of trying to not disrupt your normal flow so that you can use the familiar tools to get the job done.
Right, and there is one important thing that we need to mention when you are going by and starting to think about Azure Arc-enabled data services. Azure Arc-enabled data services can be deployed in either directly connected or indirectly connected mode. Let's talk about it for a second. Connected mode means that you are getting everything, right? You're getting the full integration with Azure. Everything is connected, and you are able to enjoy all the bells and whistles that are coming with Azure Arc-enabled data services. Okay. Everything is happening automatically in the sense of billing, usage, metrics, and all those stuff. When you're deploying in indirect mode, and we'll talk about the use cases, when you're deploying in indirect mode, you're basically deploying an infrastructure that is not exactly connected to Azure in an automated fashion, and you need to take care of the uploads of the logs, the metrics, the usage billing, and all those stuff. Okay, so what we're seeing is that customers are basically looking at indirect mode when they have an environment that must be disconnected from Azure, or they must use their own container registry, right? That's the piece that you're seeing right here as part of this. So you can actually go by and deploy those data services, those images on top of the Kubernetes cluster using your own container registry. So you don't have to use ours. Obviously, if you're going to use ours, that's a fully connected deployment. And obviously, we are governing those container registries that you are using. So I just wanted to make sure that we're bringing this up. Now, once you have that environment spin up, this is where you get to choose how the application will interact with that. But at the end of the day, it's a SQL server, right, or a SQL instance or a SQL managed instance and PostgreSQL, okay? There's nothing weird about this. There's nothing different about this in the sense of it's the same technology, okay? Only the main difference is that now you control the infrastructure that it gets deployed on, okay? So I think, Steve, like, I think that it's a good opportunity for me to maybe show the audience, like, how does that look like in the portal?
Yes, as you switch, just one thing I wanted to add to the on-premises space, like the infrastructure. If you scroll down just a little bit, the people can see there's like 2 links. There's like a planning page in the validation program, because obviously if you do that, you obviously need to do a little bit more math. In the cloud, right, you have kind of like the scale from the hardware investments from us. But obviously, if you run it on your own infrastructure, you want to make sure you do that similar to what you've did in the past with capacity planning, making sure that your infrastructure can support in the end the needs of whatever you plan to run on it.
100%. And, we'll cover all, or we started to cover all this stuff by talking about the architecture. There's one point that is worth maybe double down on, which is the validation program. At the end of the day, right, we want to make sure that you're deploying data services on top of Kubernetes distributions that are supported. That's why we have an internal validation program when we are actually doing the testing on those Kubernetes distributions and making sure that they're giving them the stamp of approval. So that when you're deploying Azure Arc-enabled data services on top of those Kubernetes clusters, those are actually being tested and validated as part of that program. Okay, so really it's an important piece, and I just wanted to bring this up. So let me show you something here. I'll go into the portal, and here I'm in the Azure Arc Center. Okay, and you can see here that we have data controllers. Okay, so this is the Azure Arc Center. If you're not familiar with that, simply go to Azure Arc Center. Super easy. Now let's start with data controller. As you can see, I already have data controller deployed, because I wanted to make sure that we're not spending too much time on waiting for things to provision. But let me kind of show you the wizard without really deploying this. So we mentioned the fact that you have 2 connectivity modes, so direct connectivity mode and indirect connectivity mode. So this is the first option that you need to choose from. Let's go with the directly connected and look at the wizard. How does that look like? I also want to talk about a very important notion, which is the custom location as part of that. So obviously you're going to choose the resource group. That's all great. You're going to give it a name, right? We'll call it MS Learn, just for fun. Let's talk for a second about custom location and what does that really mean. Custom location is a very interesting concept. Today, when you're deploying services in Azure, just standard Azure, one of the first things that you need to choose is the region, right? Where do you go by, and where do you actually deploy that service that you wanna use? So you can choose from the vast of regions that we have in Azure. Custom location is really a region that you control, if you want to think about it that way. And custom location is really a logical construct that is attached to the Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster that you just Arc-enabled. And that custom location can represent basically anything. It can be floor 1 in building 4. It can be a country. It can be a city. It can be a building. Doesn't matter as long as you know what it is, right? And that custom location is representing the place or the target location to where those services are going to get deployed, okay? So the first thing that you want to choose is the custom location. And part of the process of deploying data services is also either choosing an existing custom location that you already have on that Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster, or create a new one, as you can see here via the wizard. Okay, so this custom location that I already got data controller on top of that, which I'm going to show you. But I just wanted to make sure that you understand that this is part of the process. Okay, now let's talk about the Kubernetes configuration. So as you can see, we have a bunch of configurations here. Those configurations are basically templates. At the back end, they are really YAML files that are representing how an environment or which Kubernetes cluster you're going to deploy against, okay? And those templates are a collection of settings that are targeting a specific Kubernetes distribution. And the way it's translated is how do you actually go by and provision storage on those Kubernetes clusters, what type of networking you're going to use, how the Kubernetes services are going to look like, okay? So really, it's a collection of settings that we bundled for you, and you can go and pick what is it that the environment you're going to deploy against, and everything will happen in the backend in the deployment process, making sure that nothing is failing as you're deploying the data controller, and then obviously the actual data services that are coming around that. And the last piece for this wizard is the metrics and logs dashboard credentials. Basically, at the end of the day, we want to make sure that when you're deploying those data services, you also have integration to Azure Monitor and Log Analytics. So this is this username and password will be used later on in the deployment to make sure that this integration is actually gelling. Steve, what do you think? Is that complicated, or is that too much?
I mean, to be fair, we've shown now the easy part from the cloud. Obviously, again, like Lior said, right? Like, so you had your infrastructure, you deployed your Kubernetes, you Arc-enabled your Kubernetes cluster, you deployed the Arc, the Arc controller, the data controller on that Kubernetes cluster, and then obviously here. But from here, it's as easy as deploying any services in Azure, right? I said,
is it everything is easy, right? I mean, it's all easy, right?
No, but
so yeah, so you can see also when I basically change the configuration template, I choose the IKS on HCI, which is a target location, or I can choose OpenShift, right? And you can see that the data storage class and the log storage class, right, the service type are becoming available to me. So this is another thing that you can choose from, right? Obviously, you can choose node port. That means that the services will be available or will be reachable only if you have access to the actual node, the Kubernetes node that the services got deployed on. So I would say that this is probably not something that you will see a lot in the wild, but it's definitely, it's definitely an option. And you also have load balancer, which means that basically we're gonna deploy a service on top of the data services, and that service in the shape of load balancer or Kubernetes load balancer will be accessible from everywhere, and you'll be able to reach out to, you'll be able to connect to those data services and start controlling those using the tools. Okay, so let's just, I do want to show you the rest of the, the rest of the model. So let's just type some passwords here. Hopefully my passwords are good. I think they are. So there you go. And let's see what type of additional settings we have there. I think that, oh, you know what? I need to actually create a location here. So what we can do is we can, just for fun, let's create a custom location. We'll call it custom location, like a boring name. So let's do that. And this will, I have another Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster as part of this, but I do want to show you the process. So we're just going to create that custom location. And now I can actually continue with the deployment. So you can see here that metrics uploads and log uploads are enabled automatically. So that means that when I'm deploying those data services, metrics for SQL managed instance and or Postgres will go into Azure Monitor. So you'll be able to look at those the same way as you're looking at other services. And you also have logs upload. So logs upload basically means that, again, same deal. We're using the workspace ID and the key in order for you to go and upload the logs, or automatically for the logs to get uploaded into Log Analytics as part of the deployment. Okay, so that's really the wizard. I'm not going to go and deploy that because I do have an environment to show you that we're going to dive deeper in the next model. We're going to talk about SQL managed instance. So let's see, do we have any questions from the chat? Steve, what do you think?
So far, no questions, it seems. At least we haven't gotten anything relayed. I'm sure our colleague will send them forward.
All right.
But I think, as you're on this, you covered the direct mode and the indirect mode, and just as a repetition maybe. So if you want to take advantage of everything the Azure portal has to offer, obviously that comes with that connected mode. But if you have a requirement that would maybe say this database environment needs to be more kind of like not directly connected for whatever reason, then
Exactly.
obviously that comes with a little bit extra work versus where you can take advantage of everything that Azure has to do.
Right, right. And we see here, we have an explanation on the data controller, which is basically a set of pods, custom resource definitions in Kubernetes services, all those good stuff that are bundled into a single solution. That's the data controller. Like I mentioned, the data controller is really the foundation. That's the first piece that you're going to deploy as part of data services. So it's very important to understand that. Then we have Azure Arc-enabled data services, right? And we said that we're going to have SQL managed instance, and we also have PostgreSQL. So that's a very important piece. Now, unified Azure experience, we talked about that. Basically, if I'll go here into the tool chain, right, this is really where the unified, if I know how to draw, Steve, I mean, it's hard for me to draw with my mouse. I'll do my very best. So we have database tools, we have kubectl, we have Azure CLI, we have the Azure portal. So the reason that I'm highlighting those is really to emphasize the point that we're trying to make around really unified Azure experience and what you're used to today. So the same goes for Azure Arc-enabled data services. There's no funky stuff that you need to do in order to go and actually deploy these things. So really something that is important to mention. And the last piece before we're going to go into the knowledge check for this model is connecting and managing data services. Will show how you actually using the same tools, Management Studio, SSMS, right, and Data Studio. How do you actually look at those or using those in order to control data services? So I think that covers the that model, the fundamental architecture. So let's go into a knowledge check here and see what we have.
Yeah, let's quickly jump over to my slides, because here's the fun part. You actually can vote live. So if you go to AKMS/polls, you'll be able to guess what you think the right answer is. So this is now still all up. This is true for both if you have SQL DBMI or if you have Postgres. And the first question is, which key component of Kubernetes does Azure Arc-enabled data services use? Is it the native Kubernetes API? Is it Azure command line? Is it the kube control? Or is it the Azure Arc agents? And I'm trying to monitor here what some of you guessing. I know we mentioned a bunch of those. There's options, but what are the key components of Kubernetes that the Arc-enabled data service is using? So we're seeing Azure Arc data agents. So let's see and reveal this party on what the first question is. And the right answer for this question is Kubernetes API. It basically talks to the native Kubernetes API.
Right.
Then the second questions we have is, which connected mode supports the Azure Resource Manager? Is that possible in the indirect connected mode, direct connected mode, or Azure connected mode? Let's see what our viewers think it is. Okay. I like the Azure connected mode, but I don't try to disrupt anybody, but you think it's the right word to say. I give you a hint. We support indirect and direct connected modes. Let's solve this one. Question 2 is the direct connected mode. We briefly talked about this as we summarized after Lior shared the screen with the portal. Obviously, that you can take advantage of all the beauty that Azure has to offer. It is in the connected mode that you can manage and do everything you need in the automated fashion that you would be used from other cloud services, where in the indirect mode, there are a few extra steps you take to basically make it all work. Yep. Now, third questions. The Azure Arc data controller requires a Kubernetes cluster to be connected to Azure. Is that true or false? Let's give it a few seconds, see what our viewers think. And the answer is it's false. For the indirected mode, it actually doesn't need to be a connected Kubernetes cluster. And then our last and final questions for this module. What component coordinates the Azure Resource Manager request to deploy and manage Azure Arc-enabled data service on Kubernetes? So what's the prerequisite that you can do the experience Lear demonstrated to us? Is it the Arc Data Controller that allows him to do that? Is it the Azure portal that's all you need? Or is it the Azure Arc Resource Providers or Azure CLI? And the correct answer is the Azure Resource Providers, Azure Arc Resource Providers.
Yeah, and it's important to emphasize here that the resource providers are really kind of what connects technologies into the Azure, or what connects services, I should say, to the control plane, to Azure Resource Manager. Everything starts with the resource provider. So think of resource provider, or think of Azure Resource Manager ARM as kind of to simplify that, think of that as the operating system of Azure, and think of resource providers as drivers, like that you're installing in order to actually use different hardwares. So I like to use that analogy because, for a lot of people that really clicks. So those are resource providers, and everything starts with the resource provider. And with Azure Arc, for each and every one of the Azure Arc technologies, we have a dedicated resource provider, so you can actually go by and use that technology. So just wanted to emphasize that.
That's awesome. And now, so we're about half time of our time we spent together today. We're 45 minutes in on our 90 minutes journey. And with that, we're going to jump right back to Leor's screen, where he's going to take us through now specifically what it applies to the SQL DBMI versus in general all up.
Yeah, and we're gonna continue down, down the path and move into Unit 4, talking about SQL Managed Instance, and we're gonna also come back to a demo real fast here. So just kind of show you how things are clicking at the back end, making sure that you understand how really we are making this a reality. So let's talk about Azure Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance. Azure Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance is one of the services that you can go and deploy, one of those data services that you can go and deploy with Azure Arc-enabled data services. Dave, you mentioned at the beginning of this learn model that we have SQL Server in Azure Virtual Machine. So this is not the same. Okay, we just want to make sure that people understand that. SQL Server on an Azure Virtual Machine, that's not a SQL Managed Instance, and it's definitely not an Azure Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance. It's a SQL instance that is deployed on a virtual machine. So we just want to make sure that we are covering this. This is part of the overarching concept of infrastructure as a service. Okay, it's not a managed service in that sense. Okay, so let's just make sure that we're leveling on this. Now, Azure SQL Managed Instance has been here for years. Okay, this is basically an at-scale deployment option that you have today for deploying SQL Managed Instance inside Azure. Obviously, it's pre-installed SQL that we control, govern, patching, securing, and all the things that we're bringing with the notion of platform as a service. So we are the ones that are actually controlling that in that sense. And again, this is basically the start of the conversation around Azure Arc-enabled data services, because as a segue, what we want to do is we want to deploy SQL Managed Instance on top of your infrastructure, like we talked about. So we'll talk about that as part of this. We also have Azure SQL Database. Dave, do you want to maybe cover that? Like, what do we mean when we're saying Azure SQL Database?
So this is an example of the PaaS service, like one of the PaaS service. We actually had this before we had SQL Managed Instance in the cloud. That was like the first SQL PaaS service we offered. And it's basically a contained SQL Server database that is powered and pre-installed with a versionless SQL. So both the managed instance as well as the SQL database is basically a versionless SQL, which is important, and we cover that in more detail down below. US user manages the database, while Microsoft also manages the underlying SQL instance platform and infrastructure. And I think the main differences, but you can correct me there if I'm wrong, but one of the key differences is there is a slight change on the SQL database. That's PaaS services, where the managed instance allows you to take your SQL Server that you're known on premises and basically move in that environment without having to change really the code and architecture is like more equal, versus if you were to build, let's say, a brand new website, something, and you don't have that legacy that you need to migrate. You might also want to consider if, for example, if it's the application running in the cloud, if SQL database would actually satisfy the needs that your application has, the data needs. Or in that case, obviously SQL database is not yet Arc-enabled that you could bring it on premises. That's managed instance, but basically managed instance is the one that is the same kind of, but versionless or more similar to the SQL Server that you're familiar with.
Yep, exactly. And, good segue for Azure Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance, which is, let's just highlight something here, which is very important, right? So similar to Azure, you know what, let's try that again. So similar to Azure SQL Managed Instance, while the customer choose and manage infrastructure using Kubernetes platform. That's a very important piece, right? Because it means that it's the same offering, only you control the infrastructure, and that's a very important thing to highlight. So obviously there is comparison between the features of SQL Managed Instance in Azure and Azure Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance. Core features, we can go dive deeper into that. At the end of the day, this is a SQL engine. Okay, so we want to make sure that you understand that at the end of the day, right, you get a bit more granular control in the sense of your infrastructure, but it acts the same. Okay, so that's what we wanted to make sure that people understand. What are the core features here that we're talking about? When you can see that here, so like Azure SQL Managed Instance, when you deploy Azure SQL Managed, you get pre-installed versionless SQL Server. Okay, that's important. Okay, we're providing you with the same service and uses container images from Microsoft Container Registry. We talked about that as well, because you can also choose your own container registry in an indirect mode. So very important to highlight that. And also we talked about, when I showed the option of the load balancer, I showed the load balancer versus the node port. So again, something to think about. Okay, and we'll see this in the demo in a second here. Service tiers, let's talk about that. So general purpose is what we had until a week, or what we had in general availability until a week ago. And that basically means that you will go deploy SQL Managed Instance in a single Kubernetes replica, or I should say 0 replicas on a Kubernetes cluster, and you will get basically a general purpose SQL Managed Instance in the sense of a tier. Business critical, so we need to update that lore model, but business critical went general availability last week, at build. And business critical basically means that when you're deploying Azure SQL Managed Instance, you're getting that in a high availability fashion in production grade deployment. It means that you're also getting a replica set of 2 or 3 replicas, depends on what you wanna choose. So that really the main difference here. Business critical is really our go-to production enterprise grade offering when it comes to Azure Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance. So it's important to emphasize the fact that you have that. So we'll go over all this stuff here in a second, but I think that it's good for us to maybe, Steve, jump back into the demo environment. Let's go and do that. What do you think?
Yes, sounds good.
All right. So what I have here is I have a full-blown resource group deployment, and as part of that deployment, I also have Azure Arc-enabled data services deployed. And you know what? I want to keep things a bit clean. Okay, so let's just choose the relevant resources that we have as part of this deployment. Okay, so I'm going to choose the Kubernetes clusters, and I'm also going to choose SQL Managed Instance, and I think we're good. So let's go ahead and take a look. So we have the RBox. We'll talk about what RBox is, but we have the data controller. We have PostgreSQL. We'll cover that in the next model. We have the custom location that we talked about. That's the target location that we are deploying resources against. We have 2 Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes clusters, and we have SQL Managed Instance, as we can see. So this is the SQL Managed Instance that I deployed before the session. And I want to show you how does that look like from a backend standpoint, okay? What is that made from, okay? And then will show the deployment of this. So I'm going to jump into my control machine here. And again, we'll talk about what this is all about. What is the Jumpstart RBox? What is Jumpstart? We'll cover that in the final model for this session today. And real quick, I'm going to go into PowerShell. I think that it's a good opportunity for us to start looking at the environment. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to run kubectl get pods, and I have everything deployed on a namespace that is Arc. Okay, that's the name of the namespace that I have, and you can see here that I already have all these pods deployed and all the data services deployed. So let's focus on what we have. So I'll zoom in, and we have the controller. Okay, this is the data controller. These are the two pods of the data controller. Okay. So we covered that. These are basically the pods that get spin up first in order to control the rest of the deployments. And then we have SQL. So you can see here that I have SQL actually deployed in high availability mode. We have SQL 0, we have 1, and we have 2. And we also have HA, which is basically the resources that we are deploying in order to control an HA environment. Okay, so I'm not going to dive too deep into that because I think that maybe it will just make things a bit more confusing. So we'll stay at the boundaries of here we have SQL managed instance. Okay, so you can see here that I have a bunch of pods that are deployed as Kubernetes resources. Okay, now if I'll run now kubectl get services, let's see what we're getting. Because remember, like I mentioned, we also have services that gets deployed as part of this. So let's take a look. We'll do this, and you can see here that I have SQL external service, right? And we have an IP here that I'm getting as part of the deployment. I also have a secondary external service that also has its IP, right? We said that we're deploying in high availability mode. That's the business critical that I was referring to. Okay, so very important to see. But the most important piece that I want you to take out of this is that these are Kubernetes resources, okay, that we're deploying. So again, coming back to the unified operation, coming back to not being disruptive, this is really a Kubernetes environment. And obviously, there's so much you can cover in such a short time, and we are going to share with you more resources in order for you to go deeper into this. We'll try to stay in the overview boundary here. Okay, so these are Kubernetes resources, and the last query that I wanna show you is the persistent volume claims and show how does that look like. So you can see here that as part of the deployment, I also have a bunch of disks that got spinned, and because this is deployed on a cluster that know how to use the preemptives of Azure, it also know how to spin managed disks at the backend. Okay, so you can actually use that capability as part of your deployment. So you can see here that we have disks for SQL 0, 1, 2, and maybe to show you how does that look like from the portal side of the house, I'll switch back to the portal, come back to the resource group that we have, and let's also add the disk. And see what we have. So you can see I have 33 disks that got spin up as part of the deployment because I'm deploying in HA mode, and I have SQL managed instance, and I have Postgres deployed on top of that cluster. So that's a lot of persistent volume claims that get spin up. So I just want to make sure that you're familiar. Okay, so just want to make sure that that people understand that actually actual Azure resources get spun up as we are deploying this. Not sure. I think we lost Dave here, but I'll keep entertaining you. So that's really the Azure resources side of the house. And I'm trying to see if we have any questions on the chat. Not right now. So that's cool. Okay. So I think that before switching back into the Learn model, what I want to show you is also the deployment process, okay? So I'll come back to the Azure Arc Center, and you can see here that I also have SQL Managed Instance, okay? So remember, we started with the data controller, and now we have SQL Managed Instance. So let's see how does that look like real quick. And here again, kind of, very similar wizard that we have here. First, we're going to choose the resource group, okay? We're going to pick the instance name. We'll call it MS Learn, and custom location. Remember, we talked about it. You need to choose a custom location because this is where you're going to deploy. Okay. Service type. Are we going to deploy this in a node port mode or load balancer? I'll choose load balancer. And here you can also configure the compute and the storage of the instance. Remember, this is something that is very similar to what you're familiar with when you deploy in SQL managed instance, right? So you can pick between the general purpose tier, or you can pick the business critical. Okay, so I'll show you how that look like. And you can see here the difference here. So if I'm switching between those two, you can see here that this is changing. Okay, so we have 2 replicas or 3 replicas that you can choose to deploy from. So I just want to make sure that you understand that and you can see that. And you can choose the number, or you can choose the memory units, the gigabytes that's gonna allocate it into the instance that you're deploying, the virtual cores, what are the limits that you want to put, those are the caps, okay? And also you can pick the size of the storage classes that will get used, right? You have the data volume as part of SQL. You also have the logs, you have the backup, and all these type of stuff are basically part of that. And we also have Azure Hybrid Benefit. Dave, do you want to quickly touch on that?
So so the hybrid benefit is basically what we briefly talked about, where if you have already SQL Server licenses or Windows Server licenses, you can actually use let's say in Windows Server example, another Windows Server in the cloud without having to pay another license. It's basically covered with that hybrid use benefits, and the same applies to SQL Server, which there's also some connection with SQL DBMI. But just briefly, you talked a lot about the high availability and the replica. Can you maybe also mention a thing or two about around the backup, how that works with SQL DBMI?
Yeah, well, at the end of the day, when it comes to backup, we are providing you with point-in-time restore. We're providing you with that capability that are currently available also with SQL Managed Instance. And like you see here, as part of the backup storage class, you can decide what type of Kubernetes storage class that you're going to use as part of the backup. So you don't have to have one storage class, right? And I think it's a good opportunity for me to show something here, Steve. I'll jump back into my demo environment, and let's clear the screen and basically let's pick storage class. Okay, so SC will bring a storage class, and you can see that right now I only have one storage class on that cluster. Okay, that's the Managed Premium. But Managed Premium is really a more kind of performance-oriented storage class, which will spin up those disks. So a lot of the time, what you will see in a production environment, you will see people allocating a dedicated storage class that is mapped to persistent volume claims or volumes that will get used for that backup tier. Okay, so you don't need to use a high performance backup tier, but we are providing you with that granularity. So I think that pretty much covers that.
Yeah, no, that sounds good. I think it's almost time then for us to jump back to the next knowledge test around SQL DBMI.
Yeah, so there's a lot of ground to cover. Obviously, we talked about high availability. We talked about deployment and configuration, how you go by and do that. We talked about the monitoring. Disaster recovery is another big thing. Again, we support disaster recovery. You can deploy SQL Managed Instance or Azure Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance between 2 Kubernetes clusters and configure disaster recovery between the two. You talked a bit about migration and how you go by and do that. And before we're jumping into the knowledge checks, just real quick here, Dave, I do want to share this with the audience. We talked about the tooling, okay? So if you're familiar with the tooling, you have either SSMS, you have Data Studio to interact with the database environment or with an Azure Data Services environment, okay? So with Data Studio, you can see here that I already have that cluster configured or that DB instance configured. So again, this is the same database that I showed you in a second ago. That I have configured on the cluster, and the same go for SSMS. So that's the same database that we have. So again, same tool chain, unified operation. We'll keep coming back to that. Very important thing to understand, that we're not trying to be disruptive and everything stays the same for you. So I just want to make sure that people understand that. We talked about all the tools. So I think that we're blazing, and let's just go into the knowledge check here.
Sure. Let's jump back to my slide deck. And then again, if you'd like to participate live, go to akms/polls. I think our colleague also put it in and the chat that you all should see. And the first question is right about what we covered in the beginning of this module, which is you have different service tiers, and which of the options you have provides you with that high availability with the replicas that Lior just showed you with like 2 or 3 replicas, and using the always on availability groups. Is that the general purpose option, the enterprise, or business critical? Well, let's not have anybody wait for the answers. We go straight here, and it's the business critical, which is, as Lior mentioned, just went general available last week during build, and general purpose was always there, but now you have this option for your business critical workloads. Question number 2. You can view billing metrics and logs for Azure Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance in the Azure portal using indirect connected mode. Remember, indirect is the one where you have to upload the information, some information to the portal because it's not in the connected mode. And the right answer is true, because you are uploading these informations to the portal, so you can use that functionality of the portal as well. Next question. Users can configure automated backup for Azure Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance using what options? A server configuration setting using the T-SQL procedure, SP-configure. B, long-term backup retention in the Azure portal. Or C, configure a desired recovery point objective, RPO, and retention period. Let's see, and the right answer is C. We briefly touched on, as Lior walking us through, where he mentioned also the storage class that you can define for backup to have not the same premium storage class as you have maybe for where your data is stored. Now, which tool can you use to manage your Azure Arc-enabled SQL Managed Instance? And I think Lior did a great job in demoing this just as we closed out before we jumped into this knowledge test. He showed you can use a lot of different tools, but is it all of the above, or is it just one of those? I hope we all got this one right, and yes, it's all of the above. And with that, we're basically finished module 4. We have 2 modules to go. One is on Postgres, and then just a summary. I would say we can go straight into the Postgres. We have about 20 minutes go. Postgres, we're going to go a little bit faster through because, as Lior mentioned in the beginning, there will be some changes that we're expecting given that this is a service in preview. And with that, we go back to Lior's screen on the docs page.
Yeah. So, like we mentioned, PostgreSQL will go through some changes in the next few months as we are planning to, to launch PostgreSQL into general availability. So definitely we'll go through a few changes. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to be a bit faster for this model, just because I think that we want to make sure that you will get the latest and greatest once we'll go into general availability with PostgreSQL, the same as we are currently with SQL Managed Instance. But I do think it's important to maybe cover a few things in a nutshell here when it comes to PostgreSQL. So obviously that's the second offering that we have as part of Azure Arc-enabled data services. And PostgreSQL, we're working on the assumption that you already know what PostgreSQL is all about, and if not, we'll definitely can put links in the description, just making sure that people understand what Postgres really is. But it's a open source relational database management system, or RDBMS. So that's what it's known for. And really, PostgreSQL has a lot of ground to cover as well. It's a big technology and it's a big database system. But what I do want to highlight in the context of Azure Arc-enabled data services, and again, we'll come back into my demo environment, is the fact that this is also the same as SQL Managed Instance gets deployed as a Kubernetes manifest or a Kubernetes resource at the end of the day, or a collection of resources. So let's take a look. How does that look like in my demo environment here, Dave? So we'll jump back into the demo environment. And let's just minimize some stuff here. And before I'm showing you this, again, coming back to the portal, and let's take a look at what we have here in my resource group. We'll come back to that resource group. We'll discard all these changes, go here, and let's save some real estate and do some grouping. And let's look for the PostgreSQL in this huge resource group that we have with all these good resources that we deployed. So I'll scroll all the way. There you go. Well, no, sorry. So you know what? I'm going to do this. So there you go. That's why we have the search, I think, no?
Absolutely.
So absolutely. So
Here,
there's Postgres. There you go. So I'm just gonna make things a bit cleaner here. So this is the PostgreSQL that we deployed as part of this Learn module. So you can see this is basically an Azure resource. Again, same look and feel. So let's jump into the environment and come back to PowerShell. We'll clean the screen here, and we'll run the same command that we ran before. And let's zoom in here just a bit. And whoop. All right. So we can see here that we have two pods. We have the controller, we have the worker, okay, node, and these are the two pods that got deployed as part of the data services environment that I have. So again, this is a Kubernetes resource that you're deploying on top of a Kubernetes cluster that you control. Okay, I do want to touch base for a second on what you're seeing here. Though, as part of data services, we're also deploying for you Grafana and Kibana, which are pretty standard or common open source tools to either do log management or monitoring on Kubernetes environments. So Kibana and Grafana, pretty familiar if you're part of that space. So we're also deploying that for you. So that's what you're seeing right here with the logsdb, with the logs UI. That's what you're seeing right here. And we also have the metrics pods right here. These are the ones that are responsible for deploying the Grafana environment. So again, a breadth of capabilities that we're providing with Azure Arc-enabled data services. But coming back to PostgreSQL, so we have the pods. We also have, let's again clear the screen. We'll run the services query, and we can see here that we have those services for PostgreSQL as well. So we'll try to do this. So here are the services. I think I'm getting pretty good with drawing on the screen. I think I'm getting there. And also, I'll show you the persistent volume claims, and we are basically here. There you go. So here are the two persistent volume claims that we have. So really, the reason that I'm showing this, and I know that we are kind of blazing through the Postgres stuff, the reason that I'm showing this is, again, to highlight the notion of we're bringing Azure services to you. You are the one controlling the Kubernetes clusters. We're the one that will get you the deployment automations and the deployment methodologies in order for you to bring those resources. But at the end of the day, it's the same services that you're used to in Azure. So I think that's pretty cool. Dave, we'll look at the Learn model here. Obviously, there are things to consider here, but like we mentioned, this Azure Arc-enabled PostgreSQL is currently in preview. So I think that Dave, we're gonna skip through the knowledge check for Postgres, just to make sure that people are not getting too confused, and we will provide a new Learn model for this and a new MS Learn session as part of this, just to make sure that you're getting the latest and greatest. Okay, so really just wanted to highlight that.
Yeah, so we can jump over quickly to my screen.
Yep.
So we're pretty much in our last module for today's our time together, but we're not yet done. I do want to just quickly summarize. So you saw in the beginning when we talked about the learning objectives, I hope we were able to address those for you. Why we're doing this, what are the benefits of a hybrid, what are your considerations you need to take for that. Let me see if I can take over. Thanks for jumping to this slide. So that's why we're doing this, the options you have. We talked briefly about the changes, and then here you see under the Learn More section, you have a bunch of different resources. Arc all up if you want to learn more about Arc. If you see this session today and it's like Arc sounds really valuable, I want to learn more about this. We have the Arc-enabled data services linked here, Arc-enabled SQL managed instances, the Hyperscale, which is in preview, or the Postgres that is in review. But before we let you go, I let Leo scroll down a little bit further.
Yeah.
There was this thing, as you just saw, when he shows you in PowerShell and he runs all these queries. You may notice there's this word coming up quite a bit called jumpstart. So, jumpstart, what is jumpstart all about? Why we have seen so many references in demos today from Leo about jumpstart. And we are fortunate to have Leo actually on the call, who is one of the brain fathers behind the Azure Arc Jumpstart. And just in case you too want to build up a environment for you to play around with, Jumpstart is the place to go. And then Leo, maybe you can spend 10 minutes. We have about 10 minutes left to on Jumpstart and show the audience what this is all about.
Yeah, so you saw me doing the demo, and when I flipped to to my demo environment, the first thing that you saw is Jumpstart RBox. So we'll take a step back and explain where does this coming from. If you're not familiar with the project, we want to make sure that now you will be familiar with the project. Now you finish with this model and you know how to get started. So I'll switch over to the Azure Arc Jumpstart and really, the Azure Arc Jumpstart is an open source community-driven project that we founded in 2020. And that project was designed to provide our users, our customers, our partners, our own field and cloud solution architects, customer engineers, global black belts, everyone really that is using our technologies. We wanted to provide them with a way to be able to spin up those environments in an easy fashion, but also doing that not just on Azure, but also on other cloud providers or on premises. So if you're, take a step back, Azure Arc really is about the IT assets that are deployed outside of Azure. Okay. So because of that, we wanted to make sure that we're providing you with an automated way to do this in whatever environment that may be. So the Azure Arc Jumpstart covers all the Azure Arc technologies and basically splits into two main areas. And we also have our YouTube channel, but it splits into two main areas. We have the Jumpstart scenarios. The Jumpstart scenarios are basically automated individual scenarios that we have in order for you to go by and deploy. So right now we are in a session around Azure Arc-enabled data services. So I think that's what I'm going to click on. And you can see here that we have multiple Kubernetes distributions that we are supporting. And the scenarios are split into two. You have bootstrap scenario that are really about spinning up an environment. And you also have unified operation scenarios that are really focusing on what are the things that you can do with Azure Arc-enabled data services, right? So if I'll show you some examples here, you can see that you have multiple scenarios here that are really very detailed scenarios on how do you go by and do this type of stuff, okay? So obviously, it's impossible to cover all the scenarios. We have more than 100 scenarios as of today, and I think more than 25 just Azure Arc-enabled data services scenarios. So that's a lot. So
That's impressive.
just want to make sure that people understand the breadth of this. So these are really the scenarios. And the second piece of that I wanted to bring up is Jumpstart RBox. And Jumpstart RBox, if I'm thinking about the individual scenarios, they are individual. You're doing a scenario, you're finishing the scenario, and then you move on to other things. RBox is really the notion of taking multiple scenarios and jello those together into a single unit of deployment and bringing you an automated, full-blown Azure Arc environment that captures all the capabilities. So with RBox, we have multiple flavors. Okay, we have the full flavor, which is basically we'll go and deploy everything for you. Okay, Azure Arc-enabled servers, Kubernetes, data services, everything. We also have IT Pros flavor, which we announced back in January. That's a flavor that is focusing only on Azure Arc-enabled servers and all the use cases around that. And last week at Build, we announced RBox for DevOps, which will focus on Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes. Okay, but as part of, and we're also going to come up with the new flavors in the next few months that will be more laser focused on Azure Arc-enabled data services. But as of today, you can already deploy RBox full and enjoy Azure Arc-enabled data services as part of the deployment. So as part of my demo, what you saw is me provisioning RBox. And then when you're provisioning RBox, you're getting a full-blown environment, everything automated for you. All the services are deployed for you. And you can actually go into that environment and start playing with Azure Arc-enabled data services, get your hands dirty with the technology, understand how things are deploying. And as you can see, we're using the Jumpstart as well as part of those learning modules to make sure that we're providing you an awesome experience and an awesome learning experience. So we will be able to deliver good quality sessions. So that's really a Jumpstart in a nutshell. We also have our YouTube channel where we are, when we have our lightning show, where we're coming, bringing guests, making sure that we are providing you with stories across the industry and the community, with people that are using Azure Arc across the board. We also have demos as part of the YouTube channel and many, many other things. And the last thing, Dave, that I will say to wrap things up, like I said, this is an open source community-driven project. So we also have our scenario write-up guidelines. If you want to contribute the scenario, if you want to work on the scenario, you can definitely go by and do so. We're providing you with some guidelines on how to do that. What is the folder structure, how to do markdown linting, what are the things that you need to take under consideration when you are developing this in terms of code cleanness, Visual Studio Code tips, so how to take good screenshots, because this is very important to us. So again, really, if you want to contribute, there is a way to do so. So I just wanted to wrap up with this.
Thank you. Thanks, Leo, for sharing that. I think this is super awesome. Again, specifically, if you just want to, you did the learning, and we jump back quickly to my slides. So if you haven't finished the learning, feel free to go back and go through the learning. If you have paid attention mainly to all the awesome demos that Leo did today, go in, do it. But if after the learning model you want to take it to the next step and you want to get your hands into the technology, then you saw Jumpstart with the Azure Arc box. Great way to do that without having to figure out everything, as it is deployed in the cloud, and you can basically take it from there. I also like to point out that besides today's session, there will be more sessions. Leo mentioned it very quickly in the beginning. It is a series. The next session that is going to come up is Integrate Azure Services with Azure Stack HCI, and it will happen on June 9th, which is next week, and it will be based on Central Europe time, 10:30 a.m. So thank you very much for joining us today. We appreciate you taking the time in your busy days to learn something new, and we hope it helped you and it allows you to take the technology and apply it to your business or to your use case as you want. And as Leo mentioned, if you want to contribute, if you're actually a power user or this is something you really care about, even that the guidelines are there for you to get in touch with the team and to contribute and help us enable even more companies to do great things with data services.
Yeah, for sure. And it's been a pleasure. Dave, thank you so much for doing this session with me, and really for our customers, our audience. Make sure that you're diving deep into this technology. This is an exciting space. The Azure Arc product is moving very fast, and it's a super cool set of technologies. So, you'll see me around, I'm sure.
Okay. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day wherever you are. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.